I'm really excited to introduce your presenters for today. I know them all pretty well, and they have a lot of knowledge and passion and dedication for wild and scenic rivers. And I'm very certain that you're going to walk away with new knowledge and probably a handful or a lot of follow-up questions. So we'll start with Steve Chesterton. Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Liz. Hey, everyone. As Liz mentioned, as the screen shows, my name is Steve Chesterton. I work for the USDA Forest Service as the Wild and Scenic Rivers National Program Manager. And as Brian points out in the chat, I did recently get a haircut for the first time post-pandemic. So I am based in the Washington, D.C. area in Rockville, Maryland, in the Potomac River watershed, and based out of the headquarters office. And looking forward to getting out on some rivers, including the Potomac, maybe down to North Carolina later this year, in the Lumber River, and also interested in checking out the White Clay Wild and Scenic River outside Philadelphia. So looking forward to the session today, and thanks everyone again for joining.
Thanks, Steve. All right, Kristen, you're up.
Morning, my name is Kristen Thrall. I am the Recreation and Hydropower Program Manager on the Huron-Manistee National Forest, which is located in Lower Peninsula of Michigan. Cadillac is my hometown, and home of 5 wild and scenic rivers, closest to the Pine and the Manistee. And I'm looking forward to talking with you today.
Thanks, Kristen. And Tangy.
Hey guys, I'm Tangy Wiseman, and I work as a wilderness and wild and scenic rivers specialist. And I came to the Forest Service through the Resource Assistance Program. So I've been here in DC since I came and started that assistantship and then was hired on. So I've been with the Forest Service for, I don't know, technically nearly 2 years now. And yeah, I'm excited to meet some of you guys today and speak with you.
Great, thanks, Tangy. And we're going to start with Steve.
Thanks, Liz. So some of you may have been able to join the in-depth History of the Wild and Scenic River Act session yesterday. And so not going to go way back in time. Well, I'm still going to go way back, but not maybe as far back as the instructors yesterday went on the history. We're going to start today with the signing of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act back on October 2nd, 1968. And so this clip you'll hear is President Lyndon Johnson speaking during that signing ceremony.
So I am signing an act today which preserves sections of selected rivers that possess outstanding conservation values. An unspoiled river is a very rare thing in this nation today. Their flow and their vitality have been harnessed by dams, and too often they've been turned into open sewers by communities and by industries. And it makes us all very fearful that all rivers will go this way unless somebody acts now to try to balance our river development. So, we are establishing a national wild and scenic river system, which will complement our river development with a policy to preserve sections of selected rivers in their free-flowing conditions, to protect their water quality, and to protect other vital conservation values. The National Wild and Scenic Rivers System Act will give immediate protection to portions of 8 rivers and a ribbon of land along each river bank.
So that signing was almost 53 years ago now, on the same day as the signing of the National Trail System Act and 2 other conservation pieces of legislation. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to sort of do a whirlwind overview of several sections of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, including some of the highlights you see here in the slide and what President Johnson highlighted in that signing ceremony speech. Along with that, I'm gonna drop in a few trivia questions to help get you warmed up for the main trivia event contest later this evening. So with that, we'll go to the next slide, which depicts rivers in the United States with the blue base there, depicting the 3.5 million miles of rivers across the country. Of those, 860,000 have been dammed, dredged, or channelized or developed in some way. And so you heard President Johnson talk about the National Wild and Scenic River System being a complement to the nation's approach to development of rivers. And to date, we've got about 13,400 miles of the National Wild and Scenic River System that are preserved in that free-flowing condition. This is across 41 states and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, administered by 4 federal river administrating agencies. So even though all the presenters here today are from the Forest Service, you see the 4 agency logos at the top because the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with the Forest Service, all are the primary federal agencies administering the National Wild and Scenic River System. That system has grown over time, but it still represents only about 0.4% of all the river miles in the country. However, 1 in 10 people people living in the United States can trace their drinking water to a Wild and Scenic River watershed. So a disproportionate, you could say, importance in the role of drinking water and other benefits in the United States for folks, regardless of whether they have had the opportunity at this point to actually visit a Wild and Scenic River. Next slide. So, the act started out with 8 initial designations and several rivers identified for future study. And the system has grown over time to what is now that 13,400 miles, 226 designations as of 2019, the most recent designations. And here you see 2 lines. The green line depicts rivers designated each year since 1968, and that blue line being the cumulative total of rivers part of the National Wild and Scenic River System. And you can see those spikes along the way, and those are primarily pieces of legislation that designated significant numbers of wild and scenic rivers. Some of them were state-based legislation, like in Alaska or Oregon. Some of them were what's called omnibus lands bills, like in 2009, and the most recent designations in 2019 that designated quite a few new rivers across multiple states. And so we'll drop in the chat a link to a map for all the current designations that you can explore on rivers.gov. And it's also worth noting that there are several bills for new wild and scenic river designations that have been introduced this Congress, including one that actually passed the House of Representatives earlier this year, the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act, so a wilderness and wild and scenic river bill. But no new designations to date at this point, but several that have been proposed for designation. Next slide. So getting into the text of the act itself, it starts out with a congressional declaration of policy right in section 1B of the act. And you can see that stated here, that is really identifying within the country rivers that should be preserved in their free-flowing condition, as well as their outstandingly remarkable values, the term that Congress coined for these particular river-related values. And focusing primarily, you see those last 2 lines on protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. And this act is really the highest form of protection for free-flowing rivers in the United States, and also serves as a global model for river protection. but it really focuses on benefits and enjoyment. So not solely protection and away from use, but really focused on how these rivers and their multiple uses can benefit present and future generations in this country. Next slide. So how that policy gets implemented, Congress explains in the next section or subsection of the Act, Section 1C, to preserve the selected rivers in their free-flowing condition, and also preserve their water quality. This Act in 1968 predated the modern Clean Water Act of 1972, so this emphasis on water quality was a little bit of a new approach under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and to do that, Congress identified that a national wild and scenic river system should be created to tie all these designations together. And really at its core, the Act and the national system it created is focused on a protection and enhancement mandate for river values. Every wild and scenic river is a little bit different, but what connects the whole system is this emphasis for every wild and scenic river on three categories of river values. One is its free-flowing condition. The river is flowing in a natural condition without impoundment or other modification of the waterway, or at least future impoundment or modifications of the waterway. The second is the water quality, ensuring clean water continues to flow from those rivers to provide recreational benefits, ecological benefits, drinking water benefits. And then third is this outstandingly remarkable values term, which varies from river to river, but every wild and scenic river has at least one, what we call ORVs for short in this context. And those are all river related, whether they're scenery, recreation, geology, fish and wildlife, historic, cultural, or other similar values. So collectively, we refer to those as wild and scenic river values. And in the Act, it lays out actually two methods for designation. The primary one that I've referenced already is through acts of Congress. And if Congress does designate new rivers through legislation, that actually amends the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So there's a section of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that lists every designation that's been added to the National Wild and Scenic River System by Congress. And that's the primary means. There is another means by which a state governor can petition to the Secretary of the Interior to have a river added to the national system, but managed by the state. So a little bit of a hybrid approach, and it's noted that many of you may live in states that have state-based systems as well for river protection, which is different than a state-managed national wild and scenic river. And happy to take questions later on the nuances of that, but just good to point out that there are those two different means for additions to the national system. Every addition to the national system has one or more classifications associated with the designation. And these classifications can, their names at least, can be a little bit confusing sometimes because they're referred to as wild, scenic, and recreational. Although every designation we like to refer to as a wild and scenic river. But these are the categories that Congress came up with to basically identify the level of development and the type of access along and within the river corridor that exists at the date of designation, going from wild being limited access primarily by trail, often those segments that are in river and wilderness areas, to scenic, more development, oftentimes bridges crossing certain segments, to recreational, which can quite often be quite a bit of development, including a road right along the river corridor. The key for understanding classification and the classification for your wild and scenic river that you might be involved in managing is that there's a requirement to maintain that level of development going forward. So that designation as wild, scenic, and recreational, and that level of development depicted at the date of designation needs to be consistently maintained in perpetuity. Which brings us to our first trivia break of the session. And here you see a river depicted, a rather wild river, that it has the most river miles classified as wild in the National Wild and Scenic River System. So anyone want to chime in either in the chat or come off mute to guess which Wild and Scenic River has the most river miles classified as wild? All right, no, doesn't look like there are any guesses. Last chance. Somewhere in Alaska is correct, Lauren. It's the Noatak Wild and Scenic River. 330 miles designated and classified as wild back in 1980, administered by Gates of the Arctic National Park and Noatak National Preserve. So the most wild miles in the system. So that'll be our trivia warm up, and remember that if you get that question again later tonight. We'll move along from there. Applause all around. So I won't spend much time on this next slide because Tangy is going to really lead you through understanding of what it means to prepare a comprehensive river management plan and what the key elements of the comprehensive river management plan are, I should say, which is a requirement for wild and scenic rivers under the Act. I'll just note that there's also a river corridor boundary requirement associated with the Act, that when a river is designated, it's typically a quarter mile on each side of the ordinary high water mark of the river, although there is some flexibility with the final river corridor about how that corridor is designed in order to best protect and enhance river values, but ultimately it still has to average 320 acres per river mile in most instances, which equates to about that quarter mile on each side boundary. So along with designated wild and scenic rivers, there's also portions of the Act that identify study for future designations, both mandated by Congress. Sometimes Congress says, agencies, you shall study this particular river to determine if it should be designated in the future. Other times, agencies through their own planning processes evaluate rivers for future designations. And yeah, thanks Liz for putting in the chat. If folks are interested in learning more about current eligible or suitable segments, also known as study rivers, there's a GIS layer available to evaluate. Ultimately, there are a number of steps in that process and reports and recommendations that are issued to Congress. And certain protection requirements that are implemented either by the Act or by agency policy based on the type of study river it is. Ultimately, Congress can designate any rivers they choose, so it's not dependent on an agency recommendation or study, but that still is an important process of evaluating these rivers for potential future designation. So this one, also not going to spend too much time on it, but I want to note it here because it really is considered a key component of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, or the teeth of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. That's Section 7. And Kristen's going to guide us through learning a lot more about what Section 7 means, how that is applied. But in short, it's the section that prohibits new dam construction on Wild and Scenic River corridors, and also places evaluation requirements for other projects that involve construction activities below the ordinary high water mark on rivers, as well as upstream, downstream, and on tributaries to Wild and Scenic Rivers. So while so National Wild and Scenic River System designated rivers are not limited to federal lands. There's actually quite a bit of non-federal land, private, state, county lands in National Wild and Scenic River corridors. But there are specific provisions related to federal land management within Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, including placing limits on the amount of land an agency can acquire or sell off in a Wild and Scenic River corridor. In addition, this is sort of an all-hands approach to management of rivers envisioned under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, not just for those federal Wild and Scenic River agencies that you see depicted by the logos at the top of the screen, those 4 federal agencies that administer the Wild and Scenic Rivers, but all federal agencies with control over actions within a Wild and Scenic River corridor or adjacent land are called on to protect river values under the Act. Next slide. So Section 9 of the Act really details the mineral withdrawals associated with Wild and Scenic River designations. There are certain withdrawals from hard rock mining and mineral leasing activities. So both hard rock mining as well as oil and gas leasing, subject to valid existing rights. And in particular, this is the case when a river is classified as a wild corridor. And that means that it is automatically withdrawn from future mining and mineral leasing in the corridor, again, subject to valid existing rights. Sometimes Congress says the same goes for scenic and recreational river corridors, those classifications. But if Congress doesn't specify that, then it's up to the agency administering the river to determine whether an administrative withdrawal from mining and leasing activities is appropriate to protect and enhance those river values for designated rivers. Also, some particular provisions you see there related to mining and those study rivers that Congress has identified for agencies to study, certain protection periods while the agencies study those rivers. So Section 10, I talked a little bit about that already, which is a core mandate of the Act, the protection and enhancement of river values, that free-flowing condition, water quality, outstanding remarkable values. That's considered the non-degradation and enhancement policy, and that's spelled out in Section 10. In addition, Section 10 also talks about where wilderness and wild and scenic river designations overlap, and specifying that in those cases, the more restrictive legal provision is going to apply. Oftentimes that's going to be wilderness designations, but not in every case. In particular, one of the ways where wild and scenic rivers are more restrictive than wilderness is as it relates to future dam development. Under the Wilderness Act, technically the president can authorize a dam in wilderness, a new dam development or water resource project. That is not the case with wild and scenic rivers. It takes an act of Congress for a new dam development on a designated wild and scenic river corridor. But the Act does envision this overlap between wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, and oftentimes can call out in specific legislation that a special provision to say, no, actually, in this case, you're going to manage solely as a wild and scenic river through this wilderness, or vice versa. But the default is that the more restrictive provision applies where there is conflict. Next slide. All right, which brings us to trivia question number 2. Speaking of wilderness and wild and scenic river overlapping designations, there are quite a few wild and scenic rivers flowing through wilderness, but there is only one wild and scenic river that encompasses an entire wilderness designation. Can anyone guess that wild and scenic river depicted here, or the wilderness? Good guesses. Rogue, Middle Fork salmon, both good guesses. But this one's actually on the East Coast. Yeah, they're getting closer. This is an eastern river. Not to cheat. Good guess, Chattooga. So this is actually the Allegheny Wild and Scenic River, which was designated, Allegheny River in Pennsylvania, designated in 1992, a little over 86 miles, completely encompasses the Allegheny Islands wilderness, which is 372 acres of islands within the Wild and Scenic River, designated in 1984, with both designations administered by the Allegheny National Forest. All right, so you'll have one more chance left before we wrap up, but we're getting closer there. All right, just a few slides left. One I wanted to highlight here is what Congress envisioned related to the cooperative nature of wild and scenic river management. And the emphasis, again, even though there are 4 primary federal river administering agencies, these rivers are not entirely federal lands in a lot of cases, and they flow through landscapes of varying uses, development, land ownership. And so stewardship partnerships, engagement with tribes and state and local governments, as well as landowners and community members, are critical to the success of wild and scenic river management. And so these sections of the Act lay out some of the authorities to support that, as well as sort of the impetus and the goal of cooperative management. This can take place through planning efforts, but also other forms. And one example that the Forest Service has focused on recently is through a partnership with River Network to provide local wild and scenic river stewardship funding for local non-governmental organizations to work with Forest Service units to steward wild and scenic rivers on various projects, and in particular with increasing emphasis on engaging underrepresented people and communities around wild and scenic rivers. So we're about to kick off our 3rd year of funding for that program. And so be on the lookout for that. And in the chat, you'll see a link to the funding awards that were given out back in 2020, really focused on continuing to foster those local partnerships that are so critical to wild and scenic rivers. So water, obviously pretty important to any river, including wild and scenic river. And so there are a couple sections of the Act that focus on maintaining and the importance of water quality and water quantity. In particular, Liz just added in the chat an Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council paper that looked at the state of water quality across the National Wild and Scenic River system a couple years back to look at how do our wild and scenic rivers measure up under the Act as it relates to the Clean Water Act status. And we learned through that process that 44% of wild and scenic river miles are listed as impaired under the Clean Water Act. So even though this is the strongest form of river protection we have, yet there are, in quite a few cases, still work to do to ensure that clean water and that water quality mandate is met under the Act. In addition, there's also a number of rivers that have not been assessed or are currently listed as unknown under the Clean Water Act for wild and scenic rivers. And so the Forest Service, Park Service, and BLM have partnered with another non-governmental organization, Adventure Scientists, over the past few years to support water quality data collection across the National Wild and Scenic River system. So some of you might have seen that volunteer opportunity or might be working with some of those water quality collection volunteers later this year. I'll also mention just real briefly water quantity. that is also a part of the act, and in particular for certain rivers where that is necessary to protection of the river values. There is what's called a federal reserved water right associated with wild and scenic river designations. Pretty complicated process that varies state to state, so I won't dive into the details there, but happy to answer questions following the session if anyone has particular questions about their wild and scenic river. So, and lastly, just wanted to highlight the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council. This is a key aspect of the National Wild and Scenic River System, administering as a national system like the National Wilderness Preservation System. Want to take a consistent approach to administering the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, even though you've got 4 primary agencies responsible for that river management. And so this interagency body has been around since 1995. Made up of each of the 4 agencies, both national staff and field staff, to support and maintain consistent interpretations and strive for this national system to be the national international standard for river conservation. Rivers.gov is the primary source for communicating information from the council. A number of council white papers available there, as well as some online training modules that can be accessed there. And then in particular, have partnered in recent years with River Management Society to help establish the River Training Center that Angie leads as the training coordinator, with a number of different training offerings on wild and scenic rivers throughout the year. And you can learn more about River Management Society and the Training Center during the core competency for River Rangers session tomorrow, but just wanted to highlight it briefly for you here. And I know I've gone over my time, but just want to end with one final trivia question. What wild and scenic river is the longest river in the United States? And I think somebody can get this one. There we go, Mark. Well done. Yes, it's the Missouri. 2,540 miles, making it the longest river in the country. The portion that is designated is in Montana, 149 miles, designated in 1976, and administered by BLM. So with that, I'll stop there and see if we have time for questions or if we're ready for a break. Turn it back over to Liz.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand as well, and we can just call on you and you can ask a question to Steve. If you think of something down the road and you want to pop it in the chat, we'll definitely, as I mentioned earlier, respond to those throughout the session as we have time. So I'll give it about a minute and see if anyone has any questions, and then we'll move on. We're going to move into our second portion of this session with Kristen Thrall, our expert on Section 7. There's not too many people I would call an expert. She's definitely one. So I think you guys are super lucky to get to participate and listen and learn her today. I know I'm really looking forward to it. So with that, I will pass it over to Kristen.
Thank you, Liz. That was a great introduction. So as I mentioned earlier, I am the Recreation and Hydropower Program Manager of the Huron-Manistee National Forest in Michigan in Region 9. There are 5 designated rivers on the forest, as well as 2 5A study and 3 agency identified study rivers. The first was designated in 1978, that's the Pere Marquette, and the most recent was in 1992, including the study rivers. So we'll go into that a little farther. Just this past year, I've been involved with 5. So it's been very busy with wild and scenic rivers and Section 7s on our forests. So I hope to share some of my experience and to provide some information. But my number one advice is if you are finding yourself being asked to write one or being asked to help write one, I would reach out. The Washington office has incredible resources on their SharePoint site. Every region has a fantastic program manager. This is probably, out of all the aspects of my job, which include everything in recreation, the most complicated. So know that there's help. I have always found it easier to have an example in front of me. And I'm going to share an example towards the end, and it is a simpler one. It is a 10-page, so that's a simpler one to me. But this is the overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So the intent, why do we do Section 7? And we're referring to Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic River Act. Oddly enough, we've had some confusion with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. So that's been kind of an interesting thing that's happened a couple times this year. We're going to go through factors to decide whether you need one. Do you need a Section 7? We're also going to talk about when you don't need one. And I'm going to briefly go over the standards. That's pretty complicated process of the standards, but I will go over it. And then we're going to do a quick fun exercise as a group on whether a Section 7 would apply. Then I'm going to go into the kind of the chicken and the egg. How does it incorporate, how does a Section 7 weave into a NEPA analysis or permit? And then a brief overview of how do you draft a Section 7, what's involved. And at the end, I'm going to share the Section 7 and we're going to do breakout groups. Thanks. So really the key piece is when the rivers were designated, they're designated to protect the outstandingly remarkable values. The river was designated for water quality and specifically free flow. It's really prohibits new hydro projects and providing protection from harmful effects of water resources projects. We're going to go through each of the factors in detail, but this is a quick overview. So number one, what is the status of the river? I mentioned that I work with 3 different types: a designated, congressional study, or an agency. What does that mean when you're looking at Section 7? Does the project involve federal assistance, federal funding, federal highways, bridges? That's a common one that I see, or federal funding of any kind. Steve mentioned earlier, some rivers also have a state designation. In Michigan, there is a state designation. It's the Natural Rivers Act, and they work really differently. They're almost like a zoning mechanism, which is very different from the Section 7. So if you have a river that has both designations, I really encourage you to work with your partners. A lot of times, I'll just use an example of signage. We work together a lot to make sure that everyone understands the purpose of signing and how, if over-signing, it can kind of impact some of the values for the river. So I just recommend reaching out to your partners. And number 3, where's the project location? Is it upstream? Is it a tributary? Downstream? Is it within the corridor? That's going to determine the type of analysis you're going to do. And is the project a hydro project licensed by FERC? Or is the project a water resources project? That's probably the most common. So I mentioned that I'm also the hydropower program manager. On 2 of our designated wild and scenic rivers, there are actually dams, hydro projects. So I work with Consumers Energy on those. And it's important to note that the dams have been in place for over 100 years. So they were in place prior to the designation. That's a factor more of public confusion. People see the dam and they wonder why we still have to do an analysis. So I just thought it'd be worth mentioning. So factor 1, when does a Section 7 apply? If you're working on a river that is a designated wild and scenic river or a congressionally authorized study river. Like I mentioned, we have 2 5A study rivers. They do apply. But it doesn't apply if you have an agency identified study river, or perhaps your forest plan identifies rivers that might be good for designation in the future. You're not required to do a Section 7 analysis. I also thought I'd mention that whether your classification is wild, scenic, or recreational, that doesn't impact your Section 7. That really just applies to the level of development that you're seeing within the corridor. Factor 2, does the project involve federal assistance? Things can get a little complicated. We just had this instance with one of our study rivers in Michigan. EPA designates its authority, some of its authority to the state. So when we see a permit from the state, it actually is being interpreted as federal assistance. So it can get pretty complicated. But really another important part is it does apply on both public and private land. We do a lot. We've been doing more and more Section 7s on private land in Michigan, partially because we have a lot of broken jurisdiction. So we're really lucky to have a partner who wants to help us, and we provide them an example. They do a draft. We work with them very closely. So that's been pretty cool, actually. We've been doing that lately. This is the more complicated piece of it. Is the project within the corridor or Section 5A study, or is it located outside of that? And it really depends on the type of analysis. We have a project where there was a lamprey weir to keep the sea lamprey out of the native, to stop them from getting to the native fish. So the lamprey weir is an Army Corps weir that was outside of the study. And didn't know that we had to do but during EPA stepped in and said, hey, Forest Service, you need to do this. So it was a good learning experience for us. And really when it came down to it, they can modify, they are modifying the weir, but they can't modify it and impact free flow more than it already is. So kind of similar to wilderness, but just thought I'd mention that. And factor 4, is the project a hydro project licensed by FERC? And it specifically states in Section 7 that it shall not license the construction of any dam, water conduit, reservoir, powerhouse, transmission line, or other project works under the Federal Power Act as amended, or directly affecting your Wild Scenic River. So it really is a no if you get a request for that. Like I mentioned, there are some in place. Next slide. So I would say this is the majority of the projects that I work with, a water resources project. Anything that involves the construction below the ordinary high water mark. I really like the rule of thumb of, is it going to get wet if you do the project? So boat launches, bridge abutments, the bank erosion, bank stabilization that I mentioned earlier, that our partners are working with private landowners. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what it's not. So it doesn't involve your commercial allocation. So if your river has a private or commercial watercraft permit system or commercial allocation, this has nothing to do with the Section 7. A timber sale on the side of the river that doesn't impact a Section 7 or drive a Section 7. So there's a lot that it's not. And my suggestion is to be really familiar with your comprehensive river management plan. And Tangy will go over those soon, or your forest plan, just to make sure you know what you can and can't do. Maybe if you're out on the river and people ask you questions, but those are not part of the Section 7 process. I'm briefly going to go over this part. When you're trying to determine the analysis is, what type of evaluation. And again, the study rivers, the way I describe the study rivers that we have, the 5As, are Congress has entrusted us with managing these rivers and protecting them so that they're not degrading to the point that they will never be able to be fully designated. So they do have more stringent standards. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So if you are working on a Section 7, my advice is to work with your regional coordinator, and you can, if you're at the district, maybe your supervisor's office has a coordinator, but it can get really complicated. They all are looking at outstandingly remarkable values, the free flow and the water quality. So they're all looking at that, but they're just looking at it in different ways. Is the project in or outside the corridor? What type of designation does the river have? Is it 5A study? Is it designated? So we're going to go through a section of some examples. So just raise your hand if you think one of these projects is a water resources project. Boat ramp. I can't see all the hands, but I see some, so that's correct. Yes. And the example you're going to be looking at later is a boat ramp. Second one, fisheries habitat improvement within a congressionally authorized study area. Good job, it is, yes. Fuels reduction within a corridor above the ordinary high water mark. It is not. I don't see any hands from my view. And a bridge replacement across a designated river. The bridge abutments and the piers below. All right. See a lot of yeses. Great job. Irrigation diversion replacement upgrade. This is new diversion dam and new head gate below the ordinary high water mark. Good job. Okay. This is the next slide really outlines the process of how a Section 7 is put together. So you start with a proposal, whether that's a Forest Service generated, like a boat ramp. We know we need to replace a boat ramp or upgrade it. So we know the project is happening. It could come from a partner. I mentioned the one with the private landowners. We also have a really complicated one on the Pere Marquette Wild Scenic River, and it just finished regional office review. And there is a railroad above the Pere Marquette River, and the bank is sloughing, and there is the danger that the whole track and everything could fall into the river. The land is private. The Pere Marquette is 60% non-federal or state inholding, so it's a really unique river to manage. And so our partners came to us, actually the tribe as well as partners have come to us to help, and we've been working with them on that project. So once the ID team, or if it's not in an event, if it's private land, we're not required to do NEPA, but you still would want to run it through your ologist, I like to say. And I get this question a lot. Do you do the NEPA first, or do you do the Section 7 evaluation first? And I learned how to do all this from Eric Sandino when he was in Region 9, and he really taught me that it's best to do them simultaneously. A lot of the analysis you do in the NEPA is going to be really helpful for your Section 7. And you can't really do, but then the other side is you can't decide on a NEPA, you can't make a NEPA decision and implement something that will not be approved from the Section 7. So it's really a lot of coordination and discussion. So I'm going to go through briefly, what is the process? What is included in a Section 7? Who completes them and who signs them? So the most important thing is that this authority is usually above the unit's authority. In the Forest Service's case, it's a regional forester, Park Service regional director, BLM it's a state director, Fish and Wildlife Service, it's the regional refuge manager. So this is why it is so important to consult with your regional program manager. So the way that we have been doing these in Region 9, it's the only region I've ever done Wild and Scenic River, so maybe other regions have different processes, but when we have a really decent draft, or if we have questions, if it's complicated, like we don't know the correct analysis, we'll reach out to our region and they'll help us out. They have helped us out every time. And we'll put a draft through our team. So our soils, I work a lot with fisheries biologists, and then we'll send our draft to the region and they do an internal previous, they do a review and they send edits back to us. That's in the case of the Pere Marquette, we just received edits. So I will make those edits and then we'll route them for signature. And the Forest Service, the district ranger signs it, then the forest supervisor, then it is routed formally through Mercury, our correspondence system, to the regional forester, and our trustee coordinator helps us get those signed. And then it's ready to go. If there are issues, like I mentioned, the Pere Marquette Railroad, we've been working with the region for probably 2 years on that, just because of the funding has been complicated. So we've had time to work through the complexities. One of the big complexities of that is the railroad has not really wanted to work with our partners because they've claimed that under the Railroad Act, they can kind of do whatever they want. So that one was a real complicated process. We also sent preliminary designs to the region. So in the final packet, we have the permits from the state as well as the natural rivers permit, because again, that's a designated natural river. We also had the final designs. So when you look at a section 7, and soon you will see one, it will have the river description. Why was it designated? When was it designated? And what is the management direction? So in a designated river, hopefully you'll have your corridor river management, your comprehensive river management plan, and you'll pull those quotes directly out of there. What is the management direction? What is the desired future condition, And then what is the project activity? And you want to get really, really specific. What time of year is it? So the Pere Marquette one, we said, absolutely, you cannot do this during prime fishing season. It wouldn't go over very, very well because there are going to be some short-term impacts when they actually do the stabilization. So the timing, you want to get as specific as you can on what that activity is. Is it going to be short-term? Are you going to have to close part of the river? Is there going to be a reroute? So really get into those details early on and make sure that they're going to pass through that sieve. Because obviously, so on the Pere Marquette, recreation is an outstandingly remarkable value. So if the river is closed during prime fishing season, that's going to be a pretty severe impact to recreation. And so just consider that as well. You're going to list the hydro, what is it going to do to the hydrologic features? And you're going to go through that evaluation process of how you're going to list every single thing, and you're going to say what the impacts are. And then no mitigations are allowed. That's a little different from NEPA. There's not a mitigation process. Then you come up with your analysis and your final determination. So these are references for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act Section 7. And again, please work with your coordinator. And then when you look at your outcomes, it's the stoplight. If there's no adverse effects, you can move forward. I like that symbol. Next slide, please. So I will say sometimes when you're working on Section 7s, it can be challenging. I mentioned specifically that our rivers were designated last in 1992. There's a big question of what are we going to do with our study rivers? There's a lot of concern from the public on if we're going to designate them or not. But I really want to encourage you all to think of the big picture, like I'm sure you all are. But I love these pictures because it shows what can be done if you do these, why we do Section 7s on the landscape. I know that the Washington office has heard pretty loud and clear, we need line officer training. I know that anytime I work with a new line officer, we have changing personnel, just like anything else, that's something that we work with them on learning. This is a bridge replacement. And just a brief overview of does Section 7 apply to the activity? and what standards and how they apply. So we're going to break into breakout rooms and look at, we're going to share Bear Creek Access Section 7 was done on our forest a few years ago. It was approved and implemented. And there's some questions to discuss. There's also a flow chart that it's a PDF that you'll see. I find it helpful, but it's pretty complicated on a PowerPoint. So I do use that to with line officers to show that flow process of whether or not you have to do a Section 7. So we'll do breakouts and then come back for some time for questions.
All right, Kristen, I think everybody's coming back in. Would you like to lead a little bit of a report out and kind of check in from some of the groups?
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Liz. Does anyone want to share any answers to any of the questions? I hope you, I hope the Section 7 was helpful in tying everything together. Does anyone want to list the ORVs? You want to raise your hand maybe, or?
Yeah, it says that there's ORVs for recreation, both for recreational use and just for, you know, scenic benefit, and then as well as wildlife for habitat, and then fisheries in terms of like fish can live there, they have habitat, and people can go fish for them and have a good time.
Great job. I'll also add that one of the unique, so this river is very significant to our local tribe. With the sturgeon rearing, and it was really surprising to me that cultural or heritage values weren't in ORV. So just wanted to point that out. Sometimes that happens, I suppose, but. And the next question, discuss any negative impacts to the project being implemented. It's kind of a trick question.
Yeah, Chris, I see your hand up.
Yeah, certainly you could have some short-term impacts to recreation due to lack of access while the construction's taking place. You could have temporary effects to water quality with sediment plumes moving downstream. Those, I didn't really have time to read through the whole thing, but those are two that jumped out right away.
Christian has their hand up too.
Our group was a little surprised that the plan stated to leave the existing ramp, which could affect wilderness character. I also kind of feel like it could be a public safety issue, but those are supposed to be more long-term.
Good points. So the boat ramp, we were losing vehicles into the river. And so we are now starting the analysis. We actually have to move the boat ramp permanently because it is in a terrible location as far as the way the river wants to flow. So we're moving it. We haven't necessarily identified locations, but you know, it's going to be an interesting conversation moving forward because it's a very popular access for commercial fishermen as well. One of the largest brown trout in North America was caught right behind that boat launch. So, and there's like a tributary to the other stream behind it. And, but we're going to have to move it because it's part of that education of we can't just rip wrap the whole side of that bank. But yeah, really good points. And anyone find the consequences of not moving forward with the project and not adjusting the ramp?
How do I?
see Chris has their hand up again. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Let the silence go for a little bit there. Yeah, again, the impacts to recreation, if that ramp were to be permanently closed, it would probably displace that use or curtail it in some manner, not enhancing. As well as if it failed during a flood or high water event, you could have increased erosion in the area that negatively impacts water quality and whatnot.
Yeah, great job. I also had that little plug for rivers.gov. Not only does it have most of the corridor comprehensive river management plans out there, it also is really slick. You can pick, you can click the state or the river, and you can learn what the exact designation is, when they were, when that river was designated under what public law. Most of the ORVs are listed. It's a pretty great resource, as well as some training tools on there. So I highly recommend rivers.gov as a resource. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you for taking time to look at that.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, Kristen, while folks are thinking about their questions. One thing that I was wondering as I was listening to you speak was you'd mentioned, I can't remember the exact term, but that you were kind of like the liaison or point of contact for 2 hydro projects. And is that a typical role for a rec planner, or do you normally see that in maybe like an engineer or something like that?
That's a really great question. So it's really a unique situation because Consumers Energy actually owned the land and the Forest Service acquired a lot of the land around it. So where the hydro projects actually are is not Forest Service land. So they're not under a special use permit. And during the last relicensing, so dams are up for relicensing, I want to say every 30 to 40 years. And when they did that, there was a settlement agreement that gives operation and maintenance funding to the Forest Service. So we're really, really lucky. We receive close to $300,000 every year to use for that operation and maintenance of all. So there's 8 hydro projects across 2 rivers, but the Asabo is only a small portion of it is designated wild and scenic. So because of that, so between the fisheries biologist and I would kind of share that, but I serve on a coordination team with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state natural rivers, and then the state fisheries, as well as consumers. So we actually review and approve the projects, even if they're fixing the dam or if it's a rec access question or a rec access project. So it's very, very unique. I don't know that. I know during relicensing that it does a lot of times fall to recreation.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And we have a question from, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Kara Hand. Any recommendations on how to handle Section 7s in river corridors without defined ORVs or completed CRMPs? Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. So the 2 study rivers I mentioned, the Little Manistee, the 5A, there are ORVs, but they're very vague. And so you just have to analyze the ORVs that you have. And so those don't have a comprehensive river management plan just because they haven't been fully designated. So we haven't gone through that process. But I don't know, maybe Liz or Steve, you have more to say about that, but.
Yeah, Steve, do you have any additional comments on that?
Yeah, I would say it's basing it off of any information you do have about baseline conditions at the time of designation. Any sort of resource assessment, even if it hasn't identified specific outstanding or remarkable values, but assessing it as much as you can off of those conditions at the time of designation, and whether you're going to have a detrimental impact or that adverse impact based on the information you have. But it certainly does make it more challenging not having a comprehensive river management plan and not having specific river values identified.
Great, thanks, Steve. Are there other questions? Christian, I saw your hand up, but then it went down. Is that a legacy hand, or do you have a question for Kristen?
I was just wondering in this, in the specific example from the breakout rooms, whether or not essentially riprapping that entire area was a possibility. You had mentioned that it wasn't. I just didn't know if that was, if you're going to put in that ramp at 45 degrees beneath it, if having a more natural approach to creating that eddy was a possibility rather than using the partially submerged existing ramp.
It's a really good question. I think the way that the river flows there, I think we recognize that we're just going to continually have to fix it and repair it.
Yeah, so finding a new site or a
Mhm.
better site, perhaps in, Monday morning quarterback, wishing that better site had been chosen for the initial project is
Right.
unfortunately probably the solution.
Yes, I'm hoping it's not going to be too controversial, but you never know. So.
Great, and Jeffrey, I see your question in the chat and your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Oh yeah, I clicked the raise hand. Just I wasn't sure if we were checking the chat or trying to get people to call in. But I have a similar, I think I have a similar thought on this to Christian. Is this example was there is a structure that is already causing some detrimental impact to our ORVs. So let's modify it to mitigate those. And even if the actual construction process is going to harm some of those ORVs temporarily, and then whatever we wind up with afterward is going to have some impacts as well. It's going to change the sediment flow. It's going to change the stream bed. It's kind of a that is more of which is the worst case scenario. What is going to be longer term a more sustainable thing? Is the bar for section 7ing a new like a new boat ramp or a new public access point or something like that? It's substantially higher than the bar that we're applying here, because this way there's already been an impact on the river corridor. And if you're building something new, obviously that river is where it's supposed to be and doing what it's supposed to do. Does that threshold that you have to meet get substantially higher if it's a new construction?
I would guess yes. I've actually never worked on a new construction. I don't know, maybe Steve has a better answer, but it's always a balance. So if you have a bank that people are running up and down, eroding and destroying, might be dependent on your ORVs. But I would say yes. I think you'd have to be very careful when you construct a new one.
So technically it's the same standard, but since you've got some existing conditions and that you're trying to stop from causing adverse effects as well as a new or modified construction, that certainly can factor in to the outcome of your analysis, but the standard itself is still that you're applying is still the same, but the analysis certainly is impacted by what sort of proposed activities you're looking at, and whether it's a modification to an existing improvement or existing structure or a brand new one. And I don't know if this relates to Kara's question about mitigations aren't allowed, and that's it's mitigations sort of elsewhere to try to sort of neutralize or have a no net effect. Like wetland, for folks who are familiar with wetlands mitigation, something comparable in wild and scenic rivers is not allowed under section 7 determinations. You have to be sort of reducing the potential impact directly through your actions, not taking a positive effect elsewhere. You still have to have a no adverse effect, at the locations of the activities. Hopefully that helps, but certainly open to follow-up questions if it doesn't.
Okay, great discussion. Other questions? Kristen, how about your availability to answer questions if people have them down the road?
I'm definitely available to answer questions. I'd be happy to. I think I learned by asking a lot of questions myself, and I still do. I asked Steve questions recently about study rivers. So yes, please do. I can put my email address in the chat for everyone to see. And I think I have the most experience with the water resources. And I would say out of all the partners, our Department of Transportation is probably the easiest to work with, because they are, I mean, and it's actually really cool to see when they redesign the bridges, how the impacts are so positive to making those bridge changes on the free flow. So that's been really exciting. But yes, please reach out. And if I can't help you, I'll point you in the direction of where I can.
Great. That's awesome. Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, afterwards, if you don't mind just popping your information in for everyone, that'd be great. I'm excited to introduce you to our next presenter, Tangy Wiseman, my coworker. Tangy is going to talk a little bit about comprehensive river management plans. I think you're going to enjoy your next hour with her and probably walk away with a lot of questions about comprehensive river management plans. So without going into too much more detail, Tangy, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Liz. All right, well, essentially what we'll cover today from comprehensive river management plans is like where you can find them if you're not, if you haven't been able to access or really take a close look at it. Then we'll also talk about how CRMPs relate to other plans and policies, and then what's contained in one, what does it really try to address about the river and the direction for management, and then how does it relate to your responsibilities, and kind of trying to take away a few things you can really focus on to remember from the CRMP after you kind of engage with it and get familiar with it. And then lastly, if we have time, I'll share some reflections from an article series, which I titled Reflections, that I had an opportunity to work with some experienced managers, and they reflected on how their comprehensive river management plans played out really over time. So we have this video prepped here, which Liz was part of developing, and it gives a really nice overview of what's contained and generally how they're formed.
Which do you prefer, this or that? Chances are you prefer this. Why? Likely it's because clean, free-flowing rivers provide for recreation, healthy water, and wildlife habitat. Our nation's rivers are managed for the enjoyment and use of the American people. The most elite status of rivers, known as wild and scenic rivers, are designated by an act of Congress. This means they will be managed in free-flowing condition to protect and enhance the values that make these rivers special. The term is called Outstandingly Remarkable Values, or ORVs. After being designated, something called a Comprehensive River Management Plan must be completed. This plan decides: 1. The boundary of the river's protected area. 2. The river's ORVs. 3. How these values will be protected. 4. Various recreation opportunities. 5. How future development and use will be managed. And 6. Monitoring objectives to make sure the plan is working to protect the river's values. The agency works with the public, adjacent landowners, and stakeholders when completing this plan. In fact, during each step of the process, you have an opportunity to help shape how decisions are made. After all, these are your forests and your rivers, and your voice is an important piece of this process. It's your river. Join the conversation on how your wild and scenic rivers are managed. To find out more about wild and scenic rivers near you, visit your local United States Forest Service office and check out www.yourforestyourfuture.org/rivers.
So I think that's a really efficient way to give the layout and kind of the perspective it being a collaborative process, because that's really key. And so we're just going to go ahead and jump into where are some places where you might be able to find your CRMP if it's not in your immediate vicinity or you haven't been able to engage with it yet. And so first, I suggest rivers.gov. There's a long list archived in there in the management plan section. In addition to that, for Forest Service staff, you can access plans on the National Wild and Scenic River SharePoint site. These two sites will be linked and made available to you guys. If you're not finding your plan there, you can also engage with your district forest recreation lead, maybe a regional coordinator or partner organizations who might have it archived elsewhere. Hopefully it's not that difficult to find it, but here are some options if you haven't yet engaged with your plan. So just to get everyone oriented a little bit and aware that there's overlapping jurisdictions and policies and requirements around planning, especially on public lands. So this is kind of the role that the comprehensive river management plays within this framework. But essentially what's required from the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is that all of the things that must be addressed about the river can be in a standalone CRMP. They can be embedded in a land management plan, or portions could be addressed by either. But typically the difference between what you're going to find is that a land management plan might highlight classification, the ORVs of the river, and maybe make a few comments about protection and enhancement. But the CRMP is what's actually going to describe why and how to protect in those enhance those values, in addition to including project management planning requirements, especially like addressing user capacities in the river corridor, which we'll talk about later. There's really a nice crosswalk between the two, but in addition to that, comprehensive river management plans contain site-specific actions, and we'll really get deeper into management actions later in the presentation as well. So why do we do the plans? Well, first of all, it is a legal requirement. And so what's outlined in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is that resource protection, development of lands and facilities, user capacities, and other management practices must be addressed in the plan. But overall, the plan is what really guides what designation means for a river. So if a river is designated, what's the difference between it and any other river? That's what the plan is supposed to contain. It becomes a roadmap for fleshing out what is special. And really before it's fully developed, there's just a lot of gray areas in terms of responsibilities for management around there. But once it's fully developed, then you have a clear vision for long-term protection of values. So we're going to walk through some of the key elements, and they can be addressed in different ways using different terminology, but these are probably the best way to describe what's contained within there. So we'll kind of walk through what that means and what you might find in these sections. So let's just get into the description of the river setting and resource values. So in this case, it's important to describe the setting of the river because it provides a lot of context for how the river might be impacted by surrounding lands and activities, and especially existing activities. And so first of all, there's ORVs that are described within the river. And so those need to be documented for their location and described in detail, especially kind of getting into why they're unique. And so it's really important to get familiar with the ORVs of your river. And then in addition to that, the condition is described at designation, and also there are desired conditions for the future. And so those will be addressed in there as well. And then certainly land ownership and land use description around the river would be included in this part as well. So these are just a few examples of the ORVs that might be described, but this is really what you should focus on in the plan if you want to be able to carry around the information in your back pocket. But here are just a few examples, and it's just important to consider why these ORVs were chosen, and especially focus in on the commentary for what makes them unique, regionally unique. And then this is just a snapshot of other resources. And since the river ecosystem is really interconnected, it's just important that other resource values are documented as well. So if there's unique activities or facilities or resources in the river, then they may be documented in the plan as well. So the plan also needs to address context and coordination, thankfully, because it can be very difficult when there's other responsibilities and roles for groups like tribal governments, federal, state, and local agencies and governments, regional boards, and stakeholder groups for the designated river. Essentially, the context and the coordination should address what activities have been occurring in this area and how they might continue. There's also this element of compliance under other laws that can impact the values in the river. So it's just important to be wary of any other additional requirements that could be attached to designated values. So element 3 is really the most relevant to your work. I think the management actions and the direction. And a few things that you might find in there is that management actions could outline actions that actually need to be carried out after designation. Or it may provide the guidance for what actions are consistent with values when you're trying to figure out how to protect and enhance the values in different scenarios. But two pieces that are important to consider are desired conditions. And in order to define desired conditions, it's important to consider like the level of detail that's included in your plan, but essentially desired conditions are what you're aiming for, the quality of both resources and experiences. And it's really like trying to define what good stewardship looks like for the river. It has to do with resource conditions, visitor experiences and opportunities, and the facilities and services that would protect and enhance the river values. In addition to that, user capacity is addressed here as well. And user capacity is kind of a unique term, but it has to do with visitor use management. But essentially, to define it, the maximum amounts and kinds of public use that a wild and scenic river collectively or by analysis area can accommodate without degrading river values. And maybe to simplify further, an example would be like 250 kayakers per day on the scenic segment of a river. That would be an example of the user capacity. So here we have a few management action examples, and I'll share some additional ones as well. But on the left, we have like an interpretive panel, which the plan would have guided the decision for what to include on there, what the goal was for the educational technique, and then where best to place it. And so a few other examples in terms of management actions would be like special use permits, project proposals, like toilets, bridges, or the plan is really going to help define what is consistent with river values. So this is an example of some of the language, and it kind of lays out how a goal or desired condition for the river is tied to the management action. And it's key because the actions must be tied to the plan. So in this case, there's a goal around recreation activities. And so they describe that there's a goal to provide dispersed recreation activities by allowing existing uses to continue. All while making sure the values are protected. So in that case, the desired condition would be to manage the corridor in that context. And then it describes these different types of recreation that they're looking to accommodate. So then the action you could take based on what's been outlined in the plan here is that you could establish dispersed camping sites in the corridor so that people could have that experience. Now, the fourth element is really closely tied to the preceding one because it's the foundation for how you're able to make these decisions and the information that you're leveraging to guide the decisions. And I'm aware that like the capacity for monitoring really varies depending on where you are, but it does play a critical role in our ability to evaluate the river. And a few key elements of monitoring and sort of this monitoring framework are indicators and thresholds. And so these are terms that we use to describe what we're measuring and what it tells us. So for example, an indicator would be a measurable attribute of a resource that we can use to track changes over time. Typically, the mark of a good indicator is that it's very sensitive, so it's easy to track change in the resource. And then thresholds are what we assign as a minimally acceptable condition of a resource. And so those two terms kind of work together to tell us information about how the resources are doing. So this is just to highlight monitoring's importance because again, it really helps us to know how things are going in the river. And it's just important to consider if there's flexibility to kind of like modernize the monitoring protocol to collect data more efficiently. It's highly encouraged to collaborate with others for ideas. If you're not familiar with your monitoring plan or if it's being accomplished, I encourage you to work across program areas. If there's other types of monitoring that are being done in the area, and just consider ways to find a reasonable protocol to implement. So the last element is really like, it's kind of like the way I think of it in terms of why you might take a look around the appendix is it's kind of like the river's unique resume. It kind of tells like what studies have been done there, maybe the projects and activities that have occurred there, and it allows you to take a closer look at these different elements of the plan if you need to. And overall, it can just give you a better picture of your river, a more holistic perspective on it. So now we'll kind of get towards the real connection to your work and kind of offer a few things that you could focus on in terms of engaging with your plan. And I think overall, the way that a CRMP really influences work on the ground is that it's the guidance in what helps to set priorities for field work. And it also provides those protocols for how you actually go about protecting and enhancing the values that you're interacting with on a daily basis. And so I think it's important to start by overall knowing the benefits and values of designation of the river. I think an easy starting place is really just thinking about like land management's relationship to preserving water quality. Really, these rivers and places on public lands are a huge freshwater source for many communities across the country. But outside of that, or in addition to that, it's important to become familiarized with your river values, your ORVs in particular, the monitoring plan, the user capacity on your river, and educational priorities or strategies. So in terms of the river values, if you're just starting to engage with them, start by considering what are the ORVs and maybe why they were designated. Are they throughout the river or specific to one particular location? Are there any particular sensitivities around those ORVs that you could be aware of? And just being overall aware of like impacts to water quality and free flow from both, you know, visitors and Forest Service activities is important in order to kind of advocate for the river and the purpose of its protection. If you're just getting started in engaging with monitoring, it's important to check, you know, first, is there a monitoring plan in the CRMP and like how detailed it is? What supporting materials are there to guide the monitoring protocol? Is it addressed in different ways throughout the description of the values. Maybe there's some insight in the ORV descriptions about how they might be monitored. But the other key pieces to consider about monitoring is the frequency of the monitoring, and also just considering what the past data and trends about that are from previous reports about the river are, to give you better insight about the river. User capacity is really closely tied to monitoring, as I mentioned earlier, and it's important to check if there is an actual number outlined or how detailed and specific the user capacity is for your river, or just checking to see if visitor use was addressed in some other way throughout the plan. And then another way that you could get more insight on user capacity and visitor use guidance would be to take a look around the recreation resource description for your river too. So the educational component is really important because it really has to do with how you summarize what designation means for the river to other people, and it really can start, the conversation with water quality in terms of talking about some of the values about the river and getting people engaged with it. It's also important to be able to engage people with the history and culture surrounding the river. And I think that piece is what kind of lays the foundation for people to actually connect to the place and appreciate it. Education can also be used as a tool to influence visitor behavior and maybe subsequently user capacity as well over time. But it's really not just a tool to educate people what not to do around the river, but it also encourages them to enjoy this place in ways that they might not have thought to do if they didn't know all of the values and amazing resources that were included in it. So what I want to do in the latter half of this is an activity, and essentially I'll just kind of be introducing you to the White Salmon River as an example. But when we do the breakout activity, you're welcome to leverage your own knowledge of your own river to guide your response to a scenario that I'll present where river values are being impacted. And the goal is allow you to leverage those 4 main focus points from the river plan to guide your response. So I will provide this brief overview of the upper white salmon. With that information, you'll also be provided it during the breakout if you want to use it for reference. This would be like maybe if you're not familiar yet or you're new to your own river. But again, if you do have experience and can reference that information easily, please use that as an example to respond during the breakouts. So let me just brush through some of the unique aspects of the upper white salmon river. I also want to mention where it's located. I kind of rushed a little bit. The upper white salmon is in Washington on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest within the Mount Adams Wilderness. So yes, there are definitely resources about applying wilderness and wild scenic standards in one place. So this would be a really unique example to engage with that concept. But yeah, here are some of the outstandingly remarkable values, and I encourage you to focus on the unique aspects of them. So in this case, there's a rarity of geomorphic landforms and glacial processes, and that also influences the uniqueness of the hydrology in the area with glacially fed streams. And then the scenery is also noted as unique because of some of the aspects that are uncommon within the region of comparison. And the user capacity addresses the number of campsites per acre in different parts of the wilderness area. And then there is also a note that wild sections align with the established wilderness capacity standards in the forest plan. And then they have actual numbers for different types of activities, including whitewater kayaking, hikers on the Buck Creek Trail, and then dispersed campers during the primary season of use. So this is just one line from the monitoring plan that I pulled out that might provide some guidance to the response in this scenario. But essentially, this is a great example of what you might engage with if you look at your own monitoring plan, and it outlines the value, the attribute of that resource that's being measured, which is that indicator, and it describes the indicator, provides a description of the threshold, that minimally acceptable condition, the triggers, and the management actions that are outlined, or you're given the discretion to outline for yourself in some cases. And then lastly, the Upper White Salmon Comprehensive River Management Plan also includes some commentary about their past educational partnerships. So they do have a partnership with the Cascade Mountain School, where they've been able to engage with some high schoolers to do some water quality data collection. And then they outlined as well, if they are doing programming, the focus areas that they have for educational programs are resource protection, stewardship, low impact recreational practices, visitor responsibility, and river values. So this is the scenario I'll have you work through. It's pretty broad, so I hope that it could fit a number of rivers, and it may have occurred on your very own during this past year. But what I want you to do is think about how you could leverage your knowledge of the river management plan to respond to the following scenario, which would be an increased visitation during the pandemic last year, possibly resulting in 3 new gathering areas. And now what were initially minor impacts from those visitors have grown to permanent fire rings and social trails. So now we can move out into breakout groups and talk about how we would use the plan to guide our response.
Tangy, would you like to lead the group in a short report out of what people heard and discussed in their breakout rooms?
Yes, I can do that. I am curious to see if anyone was sharing from personal insight. Would love to hear those kinds of examples, but if you were utilizing the summary of some of the information about the upper salmon, that's good too. But maybe we can just go through each of the values or elements that we outlined, and talk about some of the considerations you would have if those impacts were occurring. So if anyone wants to share about the river values or the ORVs and how you might utilize that information to guide your response in the situation.
It may not be specifically on ORVs, but we spoke a little bit in our little group about striking the balance between, like, it's pretty easy to just say there's been a lot more users in this area, and they're like degrading this wilderness space, and that's it, we're going to cut it off and we're going to reduce the capacity. But there's also kind of decisions that need to be made there, and a balance that needs to be struck, where if you have more people coming to an area and using those resources, there's a lot more likelihood that they're going to go off trail, or they're going to like make their own way down into the river and erode a bank, or do whatever other damage. So it makes a lot of sense in many ways. I think the project that you were talking about, Tangy, was putting in more access points and more like regulated, built up gathering areas for this increased user group. So if you give people some more spaces that they can occupy, then you can kind of set the terms in which people are interacting with this environment and having an influence on it, rather than just like leaving it all totally dispersed and allowing people to kind of make their own decisions in whatever state of like caring or ignorance or indifference that they have.
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of combining some of the information that you would know about the river corridor and the activity occurring there to think of like kind of a proactive thing that you could do to avoid or mitigate some of these situations. And yeah, feel free to answer from any perspective. Like you can answer the questions from within whatever your authority is, whatever your responsibilities is. So even if it wasn't like proposing an actual management action, just how would you react and how would it be helpful to know about the resource that you're protecting to react in that situation is good too. And I see I think someone shared out here. Hey, Karita. Karita shared that they talked about understanding where the high use areas are or could be, and then focusing on some stewardship teams doing activities there. Then we'll make time for maybe one more, and then we can just move to the rest of the presentation. Okay. Thanks, Liz. Okay, looks like my time frame's pretty good. I'm gonna allow Liz to pull up these articles because really I wanted to just give you guys a little glimpse of some of the information in this article series I did. I had the opportunity to interview a few river managers, and they kind of reflected on the effectiveness of their river plans, or how they played out and how they adapted to meet the requirements of the act. And so Liz is going to share the article so you can see the images and some of the topics that were highlighted in there, but I'm just going to brush over a few comments that I think kind of relate to the elements of the plans that we were describing today and their importance. And so this article was about the Snake River headwaters. So I had the chance to speak with Linda Merigliano and Dave Cernicek there. And it was great to hear all of their insight. But one thing that Linda was really speaking on that I highlighted in the article is the collection of data, of visitor use management data. And she really describes how even if that data is sparse or informal, every bit counts. She talks about the importance of when making a visitor use management decision without the robust data. Instead, you could rely on interviews with local river runners who might be visiting remote parts of the headwaters. And she also encourages like being creative in terms of counting vehicles at the parking lots, digging up old records from the filing cabinets, setting up trail counters, or talking to outfitters. And so I think what's key is that she says that every bit of information counts. So if you can think of creative ways to engage with visitors or make other kinds of observations, that can be really helpful. And then Dave also provided some commentary about communication and how important that is. I think it gets to that educational component. How do you tell people what wild and scenic means? He reflects that it was important to go to the county planning office and tell them how they fit into the equation, in particular in that region, in the Snake River headwaters, the Bridger Teton in Wyoming. And then he also really addressed about how these elements come together. Like if everyone at every level of management and work around the river has a good framework and understanding when it comes to like emergencies, then rather than having to teach everyone that framework of what wild and scenic means, you can come up with proactive solutions to kind of adapt your emergency response to really account for the values that you're trying to protect. And so, you know, he recounts some of the fire management that happens where thousands of people are coming to rehabilitate an area. And he talks about how he was able to do some communication about invasives and best practices to protect the vegetation in that region. So I'll provide some comments from two other wonderful river managers as well. Julie Goloska, she is a manager on the St. Croix for the National Park Service. And one piece that she really talked about in terms of leveraging like her understanding of education and how they could use that to impact like visitor use and those kinds of impacts is that the local elementary schools introduce the youth to the rivers, and then the children tend to engage with their family and friends and sometimes come back to the river. And so what the agency staff do in that case is they provide ways for the community to enjoy the different benefits of the river, like all year round during different seasons, and give them tips to have a good experience there, because that is kind of one way to potentially disperse some of the use. And then she really highlights connecting with your networks as well. So I'm happy that you guys are here to connect with people who might be doing similar work, so you have strategies. And then lastly, I just have a few, a sentiment from our very own Kristen Thrall, who is, I believe, an expert in this area. But again, she really pushed for use data, that engagement, understanding the impacts of the activities that are happening in the corridor. And so she really shared a lot of insight about the rivers that she's managing on the Huron-Manistee National Forest. And essentially the way she framed it up is that you can't make a decision to tell people that they can't be there if you don't have good data to support their contribution to some sort of unacceptable impact of the values that you're charged to manage and protect or improve. So yeah, I encourage you to check out the articles if you're just interested to see like what are other people doing, either to work through challenges or propose, proactive solutions to some of the things they foresee as challenges on the rivers. And yeah, I think reaching out to folks with questions is always a good place to start when getting familiar with these rivers. But yeah, I guess lastly, I just wanted to encourage everyone to engage with additional resources that I'll provide. And I wanted to highlight Team Rapids. This is a group that was pulled together maybe a year ago, a little over a year ago now, thanks to Liz and a few other folks at the Washington office, in order to get folks from all different angles and levels of management around Wild and Scenic Rivers, including partners who are working on plans. And so monthly we put some sort of topic on the table, and either we have like a specialist come in and share their insight on it, or we workshop ideas. Sometimes people bring these questions that kind of come from the margins that aren't fully addressed, like from the gray area, and then we all work together to just share our insight and workshop and come up with solutions together. So would love to have you guys engage with that group as well, to give you that ongoing network of communication. And then in addition to that, we have a big library full of resources around a number of river topics, including the resources that are tied to planning. But yeah, with that, we'll make sure to get you guys connected. And yeah, appreciate your time. Thanks for sticking it out, hanging out.